From the heist of the century to Austin's heel turn, from epic entrances to the end of the streak, these are the greatest moments from every WrestleMania, starting from Mania 41 and going all the way back to the start. WrestleMania 41 saw John Cena win his historic 17th world title, the return of Becky Lynch, and Dominic Mysterio walking out with the Intercontinental title, but nothing hit harder than Paul Heyman stabbing both CM Punk and Roman Reigns in the back and aligning with Seth Rollins. The Wiseman had turned on his tribal chief and the crowd lost their minds. But 1 year before this betrayal, Heyman walked down the aisle with Reigns as WrestleMania 40 saw Cody Rhodes finish his story. After 2 years of struggle, the American Nightmare had finally reached the top, and the final moments of the match, with cameos from Cena, Rollins, the Usos, and The Undertaker, will go down as one of the greatest endings in Mania history. But the road to that moment began a year earlier at WrestleMania 39. Mania 39 saw Solo Sikoa help Roman Reigns retain the gold, an absolute banger for the IC title, and Rhea Ripley winning the SmackDown Women's title. But the moment that froze everyone in their seats was when Sami Zayn became the first man to kick out the Usos' 1D finisher in a 5-star main event on Night 1. WrestleMania 38 planted the seeds of all of it when Cody Rhodes made his shocking return to WWE and started his journey towards dethroning Roman Reigns. And speaking of Reigns, WrestleMania 37 reminded everyone why the Tribal Chief was the final boss of wrestling when he pinned both Edge and Daniel Bryan, stacking two legends on top of each other to retain the Universal Championship. WrestleMania 36 gave us no crowd and empty arenas, but somehow delivered one of the most cinematic moments in wrestling history when The Undertaker and AJ Styles took their feud to a boneyard match. The epic visual of Taker rising from the dead once again and standing behind an overconfident Styles became an instant meme and Mania 36's defining moment. WrestleMania 35 was the night of historic firsts, but nothing was more emotional than Kofi Kingston finally winning the WWE Championship and celebrating with his family and New Day brothers. WrestleMania 34 was a letdown, but delivered some memorable moments like Ronda Rousey's in-ring debut and The Undertaker returning to face John Cena. However, it was the return of Daniel Bryan that had everyone in the arena chanting yes in unison. A man who had been told his body would never allow him to compete again and defied every doctor, every doubt, and every odd to return to the ring at the grandest stage of them all. WrestleMania 33 had its highs and lows, but the moment that stopped the world was the Hardy Boys music hitting out of nowhere, with Matt and Jeff walking out to one of the loudest pops in Mania history. WrestleMania 32 was an underwhelming show overall, but also gave us John Cena returning to save The Rock from the Wyatts, HBK, Austin, and Mick Foley taking out the League of Nations, and a solid ladder match for the IC title. However, the moment that really stole the show was Shane McMahon jumping off the top of the Hell in a Cell structure and crashing through the announce table. Only at WrestleMania would a 46-year-old billionaire leap off a 20-foot cage onto a zombie mortician just to entertain the world. WrestleMania 31 saw the Mania debut of Sting, Daniel Bryan winning the IC title, and one of the greatest RKOs of all time. By the time the main event match arrived, it felt like Vince had already played all his cards until Seth Rollins' music hit and the Architect pulled off the greatest cash-in in WWE history. The heist of the century will always be remembered as one of Mania's greatest endings, and WrestleMania 31 went from mediocre to unforgettable in an instant. But speaking of unforgettable, nothing might ever top the emotional highs and lows of WrestleMania 30. It gave us the coronation of Daniel Bryan, but it was also the night the unthinkable happened. Brock Lesnar broke The Undertaker's undefeated streak, and the silence that fell over the Mercedes-Benz Superdome in New Orleans was unlike anything in wrestling history. 60,000 fans sitting in stunned, collective disbelief, unable to process what they had just witnessed. The most sacred record in sports entertainment was gone, and nothing in WWE would ever feel the same again. WrestleMania 29 was built around The Rock versus John Cena in their rematch, but the moment that stole the show was CM Punk leaping from the top rope and hitting The Undertaker with a diving elbow drop onto the announce table. WrestleMania 28 gave us Cena and Rock's dream encounter, Daniel Bryan losing in 18 seconds, and Team Johnny versus Team Teddy. However, it was the post-match moment from Triple H and Undertaker's Hell in a Cell battle that defined this night. Shawn Michaels and Undertaker helping a broken Triple H to the back while the crowd serenaded all three legends with a standing ovation, knowing deep down they were watching the final chapter of an era. 1 year before their epic battle, WrestleMania 27 gave us Undertaker versus Triple H in a match so brutal it looked like neither man would walk out on their own. And then came the moment that redefined the concept of kickouts, when Triple H hit a tombstone piledriver on The Undertaker and the dead man kicked out, sending the crowd in Atlanta into a frenzy. It was the ultimate moment that showed that the streak was more than a number. It was a force of nature. The streak had defined Mania once again the year prior at WrestleMania 26 when Shawn Michaels took his last stand. When the referee's hand hit the mat for the third time after The Undertaker's tombstone, the silence was devastating. But what followed was one of the most beautiful retirement moments wrestling has ever seen. HBK had lived and died by WrestleMania his entire career, and he went out on the grandest stage exactly as he deserved. Taker and Michaels had also stole the show the year prior at WrestleMania 25 and gave us arguably the greatest wrestling match in Mania history. The Undertaker catching a diving Shawn Michaels mid-flight and transitioning seamlessly into a tombstone piledriver was the kind of moment that makes you remember why you fell in love with wrestling in the first place. WrestleMania 24 gave us ladder matches, celebrity involvements, and title changes, but it was Ric Flair's emotional farewell on the grandest stage of them all that truly defined this edition of WrestleMania. WrestleMania 23 had no business being as entertaining as it was. We got a star-studded Money in the Bank ladder match, 2 epic world title matches as Taker dethroned Batista, and Cena retained against HBK. But Donald Trump shaving Vince McMahon's head bald in the middle of Ford Field after the Battle of the Billionaires delivered exactly the kind of absurd spectacle that makes WrestleMania unlike anything else in entertainment. Say what you will about the man, Vince McMahon getting his head shaved in front of 80,000 people showed his commitment to entertaining the fans at its most ridiculous. WrestleMania 22 was stacked from top to bottom, but Edge spearing Mick Foley through a flaming table is one of the most violent moments in WrestleMania history. And speaking of Edge, WrestleMania 21 saw him win the first ever Money in the Bank ladder match, an epic dream match between Kurt Angle and Shawn Michaels, Taker versus Orton, and the coronation of John Cena. But the moment that defined this night was when Batista, fresh off his explosive babyface turn, defeated Triple H to win the World Heavyweight Championship, completing one of the most satisfying rocket ship rises in WWE history. The animal had arrived, and Evolution's most dangerous creation had finally outgrown its creator. 1 year before this, WrestleMania 20 gave us a moment so pure it almost doesn't feel real. Chris Benoit and Eddie Guerrero, 2 best friends who had clawed and scraped their way to the very top of this industry, against every odd imaginable, embracing and crying together in the middle of Madison Square Garden with both world championships. What happened later cannot erase what that moment was. 2 underdogs at the summit holding each other up. WrestleMania 19 was one of the most underrated installments in the show's history. We got a crazy brawl between Hogan and McMahon, a fantastic bout between HBK and Chris Jericho, and the third and final installment in the Rock vs. Austin saga. But the moment that lives in infamy came when Brock Lesnar climbed to the top rope and launched himself into a shooting star press, a move that a 295-pound monster had absolutely no business attempting. He didn't quite make the rotation, landed on his head, almost broke his neck, and somehow got up and finished the match anyway, making it one of the most terrifying and oddly legendary botches in WrestleMania history. WrestleMania 18 saw Triple H and Chris Jericho battle it out in the main event. But the moment that defined this night didn't come from a title change, it came when the crowd erupted the second Hulk Hogan and The Rock stood face-to-face in the ring. Toronto had come to cheer the villain and boo the hero, and what followed was a generational clash with one of the most energetic crowds in Mania history. WrestleMania 17 is widely considered the greatest WrestleMania ever produced, and while the entire card delivered, it was Stone Cold Steve Austin shaking hands with Vince McMahon that marked the end of the Attitude Era. Austin had sold his soul to the devil, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. WrestleMania 16, better known as WrestleMania 2000, is not remembered as a classic, but it gave us one of the most jaw-dropping acts of pure insanity ever when Jeff Hardy climbed a 20-foot ladder and delivered a Swanton bomb onto Bubba Ray Dudley lying on a table below. WrestleMania 15 was gritty, rough around the edges, and perfectly captured the chaos of the Attitude Era. But more importantly, it was the first chapter of the greatest WrestleMania rivalry in history, as Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock met for the first time on the grandest stage. Neither man knew then that they were beginning a trilogy that would define WrestleMania for a generation. But while Mania 15 marked the start of Rock vs. Austin, Mania 14 was the year the Austin era began as Mike Tyson, the baddest man on the planet, turned on DX and raised Austin's hand after he defeated Shawn Michaels for the WWF Championship. The mainstream credibility Tyson brought to that moment launched Austin into the stratosphere and truly kick-started the Attitude Era. But 1 year before his coronation at WrestleMania 14, Austin began his ascent to the top as WrestleMania 13 gave us one of the greatest double turns in wrestling history. The Texas Rattlesnake refused to submit to Bret Hart's sharpshooter, passing out rather than quitting. And in that single image of a defiant Austin locked in a submission hold, the most beloved anti-hero in wrestling history was born. Bret Hart was involved in another era-defining moment the year prior at WrestleMania 12, when Shawn Michaels descended with a zipline and won the WWF Championship from Bret Hart, completing his boyhood dream. WrestleMania 11 is often remembered as one of the worst in Mania history. The main event saw Lawrence Taylor face Bam Bam Bigelow, but the best moment of this Mania came earlier in the night and was the most 90s thing ever. The entrances of Shawn Michaels with Jenny McCarthy and Diesel with Pamela Anderson were so effortlessly cool, so dripping with mid-90s swagger that it almost didn't matter what came after. Sometimes it's not the matches, but the entrances that steal the show. However, WrestleMania 10 gave us one of the greatest ladder match moments ever produced, when Shawn Michaels climbed the ladder and delivered a diving splash onto Razor Ramon in a match that redefined what was possible inside a wrestling ring. After this, Mania would go on to have more ladder matches and Money in the Bank classics, but this was the match that kick-started it all. WrestleMania 9 is largely remembered as one of the weakest WrestleManias ever produced. It had an absurd setting, the most disappointing Undertaker streak match, and overall a show that didn't feel Mania-worthy. However, the absurdity of WrestleMania 9 lies in the fact that its ending was its best as well as its worst moment simultaneously. Hulk Hogan challenged Yokozuna immediately after Bret Hart lost the WWF Championship and won the title in under 30 seconds. Today, it is seen as one of the worst decisions in Mania history. But on that night, Hulkamania was running wild, and the crowd in Caesar's Palace absolutely ate it up. WrestleMania 8 was overall weaker than the previous installments, but it gave us Randy Savage versus Ric Flair in a deeply personal match. And when Savage pinned the Nature Boy to win the WWF Championship, with Elizabeth watching from ringside, it was a vindication that had been building for years. But 1 year before this, WrestleMania 7 gave us what many consider the most wholesome moment in WrestleMania history. The post-match reunion of Randy Savage and Miss Elizabeth, who rushed from the crowd and embraced her former love after he was brutally attacked by Sensational Sherry, was enough to make grown men cry. But while WrestleMania 7 was defined by love, Mania 6 was built around power and supremacy. WrestleMania 6's main event was the Ultimate Challenge, Hulk Hogan versus the Ultimate Warrior, title for title. And the single greatest image that night was the two most physically imposing icons of that era, standing face-to-face before the bell. Only a few face-offs in Mania history can rival this moment, as it represented two of the biggest stars of the Golden Era at their peak. But while WrestleMania 6 saw Hogan and Warrior collide, WrestleMania 5 saw the mega powers explode. Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage, former best friends and tag team partners, finally came face-to-face in the main event with the WWF Championship on the line. The months of jealousy, tension, and betrayal all came to a head in Atlantic City, and the crowd was red-hot for every single second of it. WrestleMania 4 was a grueling one-night tournament to crown a new WWF champion, and Randy Savage battled through 4 matches in a single night to win the title in the main event. It was the coronation of one of the greatest characters the wrestling world has ever seen, and every second of it was earned. But while we're talking of Mania's greatest moments, Mania 3 might very well take the cake. WrestleMania 3 needed one defining image to cement itself as the greatest spectacle wrestling had ever produced, and it got it when Hulk Hogan, in front of 93,000 screaming fans inside the Pontiac Silverdome, body-slammed the 520-pound Andre the Giant. The roar that erupted in that building in that moment is the sound of professional wrestling reaching its absolute peak during the Golden Era. WrestleMania 2 is often overlooked in the WrestleMania conversation, but it gave us a moment of pure Hogan drama when the Hulkster, trapped inside a steel cage against King Kong Bundy, climbed the cage wall and escaped to win, sending the crowd into the kind of frenzy that only Hulkamania at its peak could generate. It was spectacle over substance, and in 1986, that was more than enough. And then there was WrestleMania 1, the night that started everything. When Hulk Hogan and Mr. T stood across the ring from Roddy Piper and Paul Orndorff in Madison Square Garden on March 31, 1985, nobody fully understood what they were witnessing. It was the birth of a phenomenon that would outlast every critic, every doubter, and every era of professional wrestling that followed.